So I have a problem, which is that this is a family show. I have students who listen. I know I have parents and teachers that listen in, and then they want to share stuff with their kids. Plus, it's an elevated subject. I know I like to mess around a little bit and I'd be kind of a dorky dweeb, but classical literature is an important and elevated topic, and so we should treat it with some respect. And therefore, I don't really swear on this podcast. I don't say bad words. We talk about serious stuff. We deal with literature that has major themes, sometimes adult themes in it. But I don't want to make it hard for parents and their kids to listen along. So I don't want to say bad and dirty words if I can absolutely help it. But this time around, this week, there's this one line from this one movie that is really perfect as an introduction to the episode. And I was like, I really want to quote this famous line. Maybe you know which line I'm talking about. It's spoken by Samuel L. Jackson. And the movie it's from is called Snakes on a Plane. And I was like, that's the perfect opening line. But I don't know. I don't want to swear on the podcast. And I also kind of don't like bleeping things out. I don't like saying bad words and then just putting a bleep over them because that feels like a cop-out. And then I remembered my favorite show, one of my favorite shows from the last several years, called The Good Place, has this running gag where the characters are in an afterlife. It's supposed to be very squeaky clean. It's maybe heaven, they don't yet know. But one of the jokes is that it's physically impossible to swear in the afterlife. And every time you try, your words get replaced with a different word. And so that's what I'm going to do. I figured I'm going to quote Samuel L. Jackson from Snakes on a Plane as if Samuel L. Jackson were in The Good Place. So here we go. I am sick of these motherforking snakes on this motherforking plane! Oh, right. I hope you covered your ears if that was offensive to you, but I just couldn't resist because it's too perfect as an introduction to the story of Laocoön, the priest of Neptune, who, I'm willing to bet, is sick of these freaking snakes at this freaking sacrifice. We're opening up Book 2 of Virgil's Aeneid now. If you're just joining us, welcome. We're working through the great epic poem of Latin literature, Virgil's Aeneid. We've been doing a series on Book 1, and now we're on to Book 2 with the start of the story of the Trojan War. And when we last left our hero, he had been invited basically to trauma dump. He's in this very fraught environment with the Queen of Carthage, Dido, and our hero, Aeneas, is unbeknownst to him, being ensnared in a love trap. His mother, Venus, the goddess of love, has sent her other son, Cupid, the boy god of romantic sexual attraction. And in secret, Cupid has inflamed Dido, the queen of Carthage, with a passion, with a love, with a soul-destroying, all-consuming desire for Aeneas. And the two of them, who were already dancing a little bit of a two-step, already starting to maybe fall for one another, are now going to be caught in this fiery web of love that will destroy Dido. And by proxy, as a kind of metaphor, it will lay the groundwork for the destruction of Carthage many hundreds of years later. Because Aeneas is the forefather of the Romans, Dido is the queen of Carthage. These are two great civilizations that clashed shortly before Virgil's day. And now that Virgil is writing this poem, looking back on the founding of Rome, he is embodying that clash in this doomed love affair between Dido and Aeneas. But within that atmosphere, in all of that sexual tension, as the air is thick with desire, Dido invites Aeneas just casually to tell the story of the worst thing that ever happened to him, which is still extremely raw. This is something that happened very recently. It's famous already throughout the land via the kinds of artwork that we found on the Temple of Juno in Carthage. Of course, via Homer, the ultimate model for Virgil. The Iliad tells the story of the sack of Troy, or at least the events leading up to the fall of Troy. Because remember, the Iliad actually stops short of the actual destruction of the Trojans. And now Aeneas has to bring us up to speed, has to tell us the story of how he lost his home, how his city was destroyed. He was preserved by the gods very specifically for this purpose, to carry forth the best of Troy and to gather the ruins and grab what pieces and bits and pieces he could and sally forth for a new homeland. But he ain't happy about it. He's miserable and sorrowful at the loss of his companions and his city. And that's the story that Dido has now invited him to tell, and he obligingly, although reluctantly, embarks. A hush falls over the room, and now it's time to tell the story, very much in the model of the Odyssey. The Homer's Odyssey, which is the Homeric epic upon which this part of the Aeneid is modeled. Homer's Odyssey also contains a story within a story. It has this kind of retrospective backtrack. So this is like Odysseus at the court of the Phaeacians when he tells all his stories that we know from that poem, the Cyclops and the Sirens and all of the monsters and the adventures. Aeneas is now going to do his own version of that and tell his story of the fall of Troy, which is important. It's important that this whole thing is based very obviously on a Greek model, because the first thing that happens in this story is we get a little morality tale about how sneaky and untrustworthy those darn Greeks are. They're always pulling one over on you. They're always getting their way by trickery. They're always trying to talk you into something that's bad for you. And aren't those Greeks so very sneaky? And that's a classic Virgil move, because he's doing something extremely sly here. On the one hand, he's giving you the standard Roman attitude toward the Greeks. This is the upstanding, traditional, conservative Roman point of view. That, yeah, those Greeks, they have their book learning and their smarts and their words and their fancy words, but they don't have what we Romans have, which is virtue. We Romans have got upstanding military virtue and solid might, and that's what makes us better than the Greeks, who might look good and sound fancy, but they really only have outward beauty. We have inward virtue. So Virgil is driving that point home again and again in this story. If you wanted to read it as purely a conservative, traditional Roman's point of view on the Greeks, you very well could, because the downfall of Laocoön and ultimately the fall of Troy is going to be the result of a tricksy, sneaky plot by none other than Odysseus himself, the hero of Homer's Odyssey. However, all of that having been said, the entire form of art that Virgil is using to get this message across was invented by Greeks. And this whole story is modeled on, based on, a Greek story about a trickster, about Odysseus, who's really good at using fancy words to get his way, but also has a long legacy of admiration and reverence, and was one of the heroes of antiquity, who back in the days of the high classical period in Athens, Odysseus was one of the models for Athenian greatness. And so Virgil is saying at the same time, yeah, we Romans have our own values and our own virtues, and we have our own things that we're good at, but we also owe this big debt to the Greeks, and that's a very complicated relationship. And Virgil manages to capture, in a way that almost no other Roman could, both of those things at the same time. So it's a genius move, and it's one of the most iconic stories from antiquity. And we finally get to talk about the Trojan horse. It's funny, I've been doing this series on Epic for who knows how long. I mean, I can't even remember when I started the Iliad, and I've been going sequence by sequence, book by book, and section by section, episode by episode, from the Iliad up to the Odyssey, and now we've made it to the Aeneid. We've been telling this long, long story, and at no point during that journey have we had occasion to actually tell the story of one of the most famous moments in the whole Trojan saga. If you know anything at all before we started talking about this, if you'd never read the poems, but you were fresh, you probably knew at least the image of the Trojan horse, this big wooden horse with Greeks hiding secretly inside, waiting to take the palace of Troy. And it's a story that's told again and again. We even still use it now in like computer terminology. We talk about Trojan horses as a slang term. We talk about the Trojan horse of this or that philosophy that seems good, but then actually destroys you. And it's one of the indelible images from myth. But this is the first time we've actually had occasion to read the story. And that's something that Virgil does, I think, intentionally, is he looks at what Homer has covered about this saga. And of course, there have been other poets who have also dealt with the fall of Troy, and every part of this story has been picked over in some way or another. But Virgil thinks there's really no great depiction yet. There is no classic, ultimate depiction of the Trojan horse story. And so he slides in, he slots himself in there, and he has Aeneas tell that story. And he tells it in this way that brings up all of these complications about Greekness, because the other thing that happens, of course, here is that our old pal Odysseus comes back. We know Odysseus, if you've been following along with this whole series. We spent a lot of time with Odysseus when I did my series on the Odyssey. And at the very end, I did an episode about how Odysseus lives on in memory and in literature, but he has kind of a complicated legacy. He's not just a hero, he's also somebody that the Greeks themselves feel kind of conflicted about. How do we feel about the fact that one of our big heroes is also a liar, is also a serial pathological liar, according to some perspectives? And the Greek tragedians really play with this, mess around with it. Ovid, another poet from the Augustan era in Rome, plays around with it and talks a lot about it. And Virgil here makes hay with it. Something to note, if you don't know this already, Odysseus' name in Latin is Ulysses. And so if you're reading along at home, you will be reading about Ulysses. That's the same guy as our old fella, Odysseus. It's just that we're now talking in Roman terms. And in much the same way, the goddess Minerva, or Pallas, is also the goddess Athena. The Greeks typically called her Athena, sometimes Pallas Athena. The Romans call her Minerva. That's a major character also in the poem here. And so is Neptune, who is Poseidon. So we've got the Greek god Poseidon turned into the Roman god Neptune. We've got the Greek goddess Athena turned into the Roman goddess Minerva. And we've got the Greek hero Odysseus turned into the Roman character, trickster Ulysses. So but those are all the same people. They're all the same stories, except from a radically different perspective. And so, as you will recall, Ulysses, that is Odysseus, is a master of the rhetorical arts. He is an expert in all of those figures of speech that I've been telling you about as we go through, all of the different ways to use words to reveal and to conceal. Not logic, right? Logic and grammar are the formal arts of how you connect thoughts in valid ways to lead to truth. Rhetoric is the art of how you decorate those thoughts or construct or express those thoughts in such a way as to persuade. And you can use rhetoric. Rhetoric is a truth-neutral art. You can use rhetoric to persuade of true, logically true things, or you can use rhetoric to cover up flaws in your logic or to confuse, to cast a screen of ambiguity over things which, if stated plainly, would be awful and everybody would hate. You can use euphemisms, all that stuff. Odysseus is all about that. And we see that in the Odyssey. We really see it here. And to the Romans, this is real sus. This is hella sus how the Greeks do this. In fact, this is probably the central objection that good, upstanding, traditional Romans have to that corrupting Greek influence. Because the Romans, and I've said this before, the Romans stand in a relationship to the Greeks kind of like the relationship that we Americans stand in to the British. We always think of the British as super smart and maybe a little bit evil. The British in our movies are always the geniuses and the supervillains. And the Romans, who become much more powerful than the Greeks and who dominate the Mediterranean, where the Greeks used to be one of the major powers, always feel a little bit insecure and inferior about Greek culture, as evidenced, Exhibit A, by the fact that the great Latin epic is basically a reproduction of the great Greek epics. Virgil has to do this. He has to somehow assert Rome's place in the tradition which the Greeks undisputably own. And that complication is there throughout basically the process of turning Rome from a republic into an empire. After the Carthaginian Wars, especially after the Second Punic Wars, Greece looms larger and larger until ultimately it becomes part of the Roman Empire. But as Horace, the Latin poet, famously wrote, Greece, once conquered her savage captor. So Rome was this brute, this lumbering gorilla that came in, smashed everything up, took over Greece, and then Greece took over Rome from inside. And that's something the Romans feel very conflicted about. They want that Greek eloquence, but they don't want to lose their commitment to the truth and to virtue as they see it. And this is encapsulated beautifully in a story that I just want to touch upon to give you a flavor for this relationship, because we're about to see it kind of modeled, beautifully depicted in Virgil, but I want us to get the normcore version of it. And I think we see it perfectly in Plutarch's Life of Cato the Elder. So Cato the Elder was the embodiment of Roman virtue at a time when Roman republican virtue was starting to fall out of fashion. Cato the Elder distinguished himself in the Second Punic War, and it was just after the Second Punic War that Rome started to transform, started to grow, started to take in other cultures, and started to look toward these centers of culture like Greece for instruction on how to refine itself. And so Plutarch tells a story that is true, a true story about the delegation of the philosophers in 155 BC. Carneades, the academic philosopher, and Diogenes, the Stoic, came to Rome. They were trying to overturn a fine. They had a particular political aim. But while they were there, they made kind of a press tour. And all the young men in Rome, says Plutarch, were very, very interested to learn from them, just like all the young men in Athens used to love to sit at the feet of the sophists. And here's what Plutarch says. He says, no one else in Rome had any objection to some Greek culture, to get the young boys getting some Greek culture and spending time with such impressive men. But right from the start, Cato disliked the aspiration for intellectual pursuits, which was flooding into Rome, since he worried that the young men of the city might divert their energies there and find a reputation for eloquence more desirable than one gained from practical military achievements. So Cato the Elder, alone among his peers at this period in Rome of great enthusiasm and optimism, of kind of outward-looking cosmopolitanism, this old Roman who's clinging to these sort of agrarian virtues, the virtues of the farm and staying home and not being too showy with your money, he's suspicious. He doesn't know what to think about these Greeks. In fact, he knows that he dislikes Greek philosophy and learning in general. And he has a great line where he says, there's no reason for us to waste these philosophers' time. They can persuade us of absolutely anything. And so we might as well just send them on their way. In other words, he's saying, if the Greek skill is to make the weaker argument the stronger and to rhetorically decorate absolutely any argument at all so that it looks persuasive, then what's the point of speech at all? If you can argue for anything, why argue for anything in particular? So we can just send them home. These men can return to their schools where they can hold discussions with Greek boys, while young Romans rediscover their former obedience to the laws and their rulers. So that gives you a sense of who Cato was, and he was that guy through and through. It also shows you what kind of identity crisis the Romans are in for here. And by the time Virgil is writing, that identity crisis is in full swing, because now we're into the empire, and now Rome definitively has changed from what it was in Cato's day, and from that kind of martial vigor of the stern farmer soldier man that Cato was. They're still a military superpower, in fact, never more so, but they are also a cosmopolis. They're starting to take in every different civilization from the world, and the Greeks are number one for them to be thinking about. And of course, Virgil is going to revisit this theme throughout the epic. And this is one of the first places where he really hammers it home. And so this whole opening section is a masterclass in character assassination. The whole thing portrays Greeks as scoundrels, as these little sneaky and morally vapid, in fact, I would say not just amoral, but immoral, sneaky tricksters. And so it's like 911, I would like to report a murder of the Greeks' cultural legacy. And yet, character assassination is the sincerest form of flattery. The fact that Virgil feels the need to do this while conspicuously writing a Greek-style poem tells you everything that you need to know about what Virgil is trying to get across here. And he does it masterfully with another ring composition. This is something we've observed a lot in the poem, where you'll have what we call, technically, we nerds like to call it chiastic structure, where you start with one thing, one story or theme, and then you introduce a new one, and then you complete the new theme before you bring that first original theme back and you complete it. And Virgil does this here in miniature with the stories of Laocoön and Sinon. Laocoön is the Trojan priest of Neptune or Poseidon. Sinon is the Greek suppliant who pretends to have been left behind by the Greeks. He is fighting on the side of the Greeks, and he's secretly trying to get the Trojans to let their guard down, but in doing so, of course, he has to pretend to be on the side of the Trojans. So you have Laocoön, who is the Trojans' actual friend, Sinon, who is their false friend, and the story gets told, opening of Laocoön, Sinon story, and Sinon story, closing of Laocoön's story. And the ultimate picture, the impression that is given here, is a doomed truth wrapped around a false lie. And the pinnacle, the climax of it, of course, is these serpents, the image of the serpents that coil and wrap around the virtuous Laocoön and squeeze him to death. So Virgil is mimicking with his structure, with his story structure, the idea that he's getting across, that the truth is being swallowed up in a lie, even though the truth ought to encapsulate the lie. And of course, the central image is the image of this wooden horse with the trickster Greeks inside. So what looks like one thing on the outside is actually a hollow shell with something else and something deadly on the inside. Virgil does this in a million different ways in this little section, this little story that kind of kicks off Aeneas's account, Aeneas's relation. And remember, all of this is going to be told from the point of view of Aeneas. First thing that happens, Trojans wake up, and there's a big horse outside the gates. What's this about? What's going on with that big old horse, they wonder. Natural thing to ask. Secretly, what has happened is that the Greeks have sailed off to the island Tenedos, to a bay just out of sight, and they're hiding there, and they're waiting to spring their trap. And Virgil, via Aeneas, tells us that this is what's going on, but obviously the Trojans don't know. That's part of the ploy. And they're standing around, and they're kind of scratching their heads, and they're debating about whether or not to bring this object in. And Laocoön comes running to advise against it. In fact, he throws a spear. He makes a big speech, and he throws a spear into the belly of the horse, which just avoids killing a Greek, or the Greeks avoid crying out. But Laocoön is resolute. He says, I do not trust these guys, and he has one of the most famous lines in all of Latin literature, Timeo Danaos et dona ferentes. And I say it in Latin because people quote it in Latin a lot, and if you quote it in Latin at cocktail parties, you will impress the fellas or the ladies, whoever you're trying to impress. I fear Greeks, even bearing gifts. This is what you say when somebody is trying to get in your good graces, but you're saying, I don't trust that guy. Even bearing great gifts, I fear Greeks. Classic line, and something you will now recognize and see if you haven't already. That's the opening salvo, is basically this setup of this theme that the Greeks are tricky, and the Greeks can look good and talk good, but they're always trying to sneak into your empire and erode your virtue from the inside, right? Wink, wink. Hey, Romans. Hey, Roman Empire. That's what happens. The Trojan horse from back then is also the Greeks from now, right? Virgil is like flashing all these big neon signs, and then along comes Sinon. And Sinon is going to do all of the things that that Laocoön says Greeks do. He's going to tell them a false story that looks really nice, and he's going to persuade them, and he's going to trick them and ensorcel them with all these nice words, and it's going to work like a charm, which is the other brilliant thing that Virgil does here, is he says, yeah, we know all these things about the Greeks. We know that they can trick us. We know that fancy, lovely rhetoric, beautiful, ornate words can lead you into doing stuff you don't want to do. And even when you know that, you can't stop it from happening. So, hey, also Romans, maybe even though you know that the Greeks have this seductive allure, that doesn't make you immune to it. Maybe the fact that you're aware of it doesn't actually save you from becoming Hellenized, from becoming Greek, just as I, Virgil, have made this pinnacle of artistic achievement by ripping off the Greeks. So here's Sinon, and Sinon tells this very convoluted story, which is masterfully constructed in all sorts of ways and designed basically to play on the Trojans' heartstrings. He's kind of the classic, sleeper agent asylum seeker. Now in immigration debates, when everybody's claiming asylum because they're saying, I'm fleeing from persecution in my home country, and I'm very afraid of my past, but also I'm afraid that these modern people, the Americans, are going to do a racism against me, and please don't do a racism against poor me. I'm just an asylum seeker. When in fact, it turns out he is the scorpion riding on the frog, or whatever that metaphor is. He's waiting to sting the Trojans, but he's playing on their sense of themselves as generous, tolerant, open-hearted peoples. And he says, basically, I've been hung out to dry by the Greeks because I wouldn't fall for their tricksy, dishonest wiles. So he's even larding in this idea that he's the only honest guy on the Greek side. He's the only honest one that can be trusted on. And by claiming that he's a victim of Greek treachery, he makes it possible to do Greek treachery himself. So he starts out with this story that he was a ward of Palamedes, which, so far as we can tell, kind of unreliable narrator, but this part seems to be true, that Sinon says, I was a ward of this character, Palamedes. And he says, all men know of this. No man is ignorant of what I say. Everyone knows about Palamedes, and he's referring presumably to the tradition of the story of the Iliad. But the irony here is there are a million different versions of the Palamedes story, and Palamedes isn't even in the Iliad. So the most famous version of the Trojan story doesn't include Palamedes, and all the other versions that are on offer seem to conflict with one another. So he tells you, everybody knows this, and I don't need to explain it. And then the trick that Virgil is hiding there, he means for us, I think, to notice that this story actually isn't very well known and isn't totally clear. And so he expects us to know it, or he suggests that we should know it, at the same time as casting all of this doubt, raising all of this doubt about what really is happening, what really is going on. So Sinon actually does need very much to tell us his version of the Palamedes story, and he is well aware of that. He's baiting the Trojans. He's like, I don't need to tell you all of this, so that the Trojans will be like, no, wait, you do need to tell us what's going on, what's the story, and they'll want to hear more. So the version of the Palamedes story that Sinon gives us seems, to me at least, basically modeled after the one that shows up in another author called Hyginus. And Hyginus is roughly contemporary with Virgil, composer of this book called the Fabulae, or sometimes you'll hear it called the Genealogiae. It's like a handbook of myth, essentially, kind of useful list of different characters and things. And the version that Hyginus gives us is that when Odysseus was called to Troy, called to the Trojan War, he tried to get out of it by pretending he was insane. So right off the bat, we have a story of Odysseus as a dishonest and dishonorable trickster. He's trying to get out of his military service, trying to get out of the promise he made to defend the marriage of Helen and Menelaus by pretending to be crazy. He yokes a donkey and an ox together to the same plow. This makes everything go haywire, and it looks like he's crazy. But Palamedes guesses what's going on because he knows Odysseus, so he's honest, and he says, no, you're not going to get away with it. And this leads to a grudge between Ulysses and Palamedes. And Hyginus tells us that Ulysses gets back at Palamedes through another trick, another dastardly, dishonest kind of deceit. And this time he frames Palamedes. He plants this false letter. He takes a Phrygian captive, that is a prisoner of war, gives him a letter that he's supposed to carry to Priam, the king of Troy. And the letter says, here's a gift to Palamedes from Priam. So he's making up this story that there was a gift being sent from the king of Troy to Palamedes, this Greek soldier that Odysseus has it out for. And when this is discovered, he has the Phrygian soldier killed so that the letter is discovered. And then he has all this gold, or silver rather, he has all this silver ready and waiting as the quote-unquote gift that quote-unquote Priam was quote-unquote sending to quote-unquote Palamedes. Lies, all lies. But of course, this is such a brilliant ruse that the army thinks Palamedes is dishonest and disloyal and making a backroom deal with the king of the enemy, and so they have Palamedes executed and killed. That's the version of the story that's in the background here and that Sinon is telling. There are other versions. I'm not going to go into them because it's already confusing and convoluted enough, but just to say, part of the ploy here is that the Trojans actually do need Sinon to tell them blow for blow everything that would happen. Then he says, Sinon says, I ratted on Ulysses, because I remember Sinon is Palamedes' guy. He was sent to learn very young from Palamedes. He loves Palamedes. He's driven mad with grief, and he rats on Ulysses. He tells about how Ulysses did this, and from that moment on, Ulysses turns his attention to Sinon. And now Ulysses, just as Ulysses had it in for Palamedes, now he's got it in for Sinon. And this is his next mark. So I've translated a bit of this speech here because it gets real good. As always in these episodes, I'm doing my own new translation. This is an Alexandrine translation. That is, I'm taking the Latin of Virgil and turning it into a 6-foot English line, unrhymed. And here we go, picking up with the speech. Sinon has just described the whole Palamedes situation. Now he's saying, Odysseus has it in for me, and here's how it goes. He says, from here on out, my ruin started to sink in. From here on out, relentlessly, Odysseus began to terrorize me with fresh villainy. He seeded whispers all along the rank and file, dropping vague suggestions, knowing what he did. He wanted weapons, and he never once let up until the ministrations of his lackey, Calchas. But why rehearse this useless story? What's the point? If you've already filed every Greek away under one heading, you don't want to know all this. You've heard enough. Exact your punishment at last. The Ithacan would be delighted, and the sons of Atreus would pay good money just to watch. So, the plot thickens, because right at the moment when we're going to get the climactic story, we get a break-off in mid-sentence. He just stops talking about this. And down the road, when we do our segment on rhetorical figures, I'm going to talk all about this as a mode of rhetorical speech. But for now, we just know that we have this cliffhanger moment. Calchas did what? Calchas is another famous character from Homer. He's the prophet that tells the Greeks what they need to do, and often in unwelcome terms. So, for instance, he explained when, in Book 1 of the Iliad, when a plague breaks out, he explains that it's the wrath of Apollo because of Agamemnon's high-handed treatment of the priest Chryses, and that means they have to give back Chryseis, and it kicks off the whole thing. So it's a very messy truth that Calchas tells, but he is a visionary, he is a prophet, he is a seer. Here, Sinon is portraying him as basically a hired man, which is another thing that often comes up in Homer, this idea that the prophets are actually on the take and they're being paid. And very cleverly, Virgil has Sinon say that it's calcante ministro, which you can hear it means like with Calchas ministering, but in Latin the word minister means like a subservient kind of lackey, and lackey is how I've translated it there, because he's saying Calchas is supposed to be serving the god, but he's actually in hoc to Odysseus, and he's telling all these false stories, all these rumors and false truths. But you don't need me to tell this, because what's the point? Nothing I say is going to convince you. You're unpersuadable. And so then right at this moment where he's ready to tell us the most exciting part of the story, what did Calchas do? It's pointless to tell you. This is almost the inverse of what Cato the Elder said, that he won't listen to any Greeks because they can persuade you of anything. Now Sinon is saying, you Trojans, you're not going to listen to anything. I can't persuade you. Your mind's already made up because you just hate Greeks. You're Hellenophobic. You won't listen to any Greeks. You have Greekophobia, and you're just going to put me to death anyway. You've already got me in chains. And this is playing right into Odysseus' hands. Let me tell you, at the end there, the Ithacan, that is Odysseus, would be delighted, and the sons of Atreus, that is Agamemnon and Menelaus, would pay good money for this. They would be so happy to see that their ploy has worked. I guess you're going to kill me now. And this works perfectly on Priam, king of the Trojans. He says, no, we're not Hellenophobic, we're not Greekophobic, we're actually very tolerant and open-minded, and you guys, you can be let free. He commands to have Sinon set free of his chains, and now they ask him, please, friend, come and tell us more about this evil plot of the Greeks, not knowing that this is it, this is the plot. So it's so great, the plot is so deftly woven, and now we get the whole story about what Sinon says the Greeks are presumably, supposedly doing. And at this point, actually, I think that the popular imagination might have a different version of the story. So you might have heard a different version of the story than we get in Virgil, which is kind of interesting. Typically, I think when people tell the story of the Trojan horse, they say the Greeks pretended that they were giving a gift to the Trojans of truce, of peace, and they were done with war, and so they were leaving and going home. Sinon doesn't quite say that. He says what happened is the Greeks were trying to figure out why the war was dragging on so long, and they realized that their number one patron goddess, Athena, was mad at them. And she was mad because Odysseus, again, all about that tricky Odysseus, and Diomedes stole the Palladium, a sculpture, a statue of Athena, out of its temple in Troy. And because of that, because Athena is mad, we can't get anything done. And so we have to sail home to get new omens, essentially, get ready for a new, fresh venture. And so we will make this offering, this object of sort of propitiation, this horse. And we really better hope that the Trojans don't take it into their walls. Please, don't throw me in the briar patch. If you know that old story from the Tales of Uncle Remus where the rabbit says, please don't send us in the briar patch, because that's exactly where he wants to go. Please don't take the Trojan horse in, because if you take it in, you'll be unbeatable. It's an invulnerable good luck charm. And so please don't take it in. We really don't want you to. And that's what Sinon says the Greeks are doing, which naturally, of course, makes the Trojans want to take the Trojan horse in. So it's actually even cleverer than the typical version of the story, because this means that the Trojans are going to be expecting a fresh assault from the Greeks, and they need to take this Trojan horse in ASAP, as quickly as possible. They got to get this horse into their city, which in fact will be their undoing and will bring the Greeks in. And so Sinon says that what's happened is the Greeks have left him there as a sacrifice to Apollo. The dirty prophet, Calchas, has been paid off by Odysseus to demand the life of Sinon to satisfy Apollo. And this, on Sinon's part, is very clever in and of itself. It's very poetically appropriate, because the story goes that the Greeks had to make a sacrifice to get to Troy. They had to sacrifice Iphigenia, the daughter of Agamemnon, to Diana, the sister of Apollo. And so this is its own, Sinon is forming his own little ring composition, his own little two-part structure, by linking his lie to the truth of the original story. The Greeks had to sacrifice to Diana to get to Troy. Now they have to sacrifice to Apollo to get back away from Troy. And I, Sinon, am the human sacrifice that they have offered up to you to satisfy the so-called fake wrath of Apollo, as lied about by Calchas. So this is Greek lies about Greek lies about Greek lies. This is lies all the way down, turtles to infinity. This is an incredible act of dishonesty and subterfuge on Sinon's part, and Virgil has constructed it to be maximally dishonest. He's telling about the tricks of Ulysses while actually being a trickster himself, telling a story about a story that calls into question even the story of the Odyssey and the Iliad. Because if all this is true, where was Palamedes in the Odyssey? Did he get cut out? Was he too inconvenient? Did Homer not want to tell? Was Homer one of those tricksy Greeks? And so even the great Homer, even the originator of this whole tradition, is called into question by this one dishonest Greek, Sinon. And so that is what Virgil is doing. That's how he's kind of ensnaring us. And meanwhile, he's wrapping this web of lies around Laocoön himself, the one man who sees through it. And so the ring composition story comes to an end when the Trojans decide they're going to take the Trojan horse in, and Laocoön, the only man who could stop them, meets his doom in one of the goriest and most terrifying, chilling passages. Another passage that I had to translate as a young man on the AP Latin exam was this famous depiction of Laocoön strangled to death with his two sons by serpents who slither up from Tenedos and take refuge at the statue of Athena. And this is, again, very clever, very canny on Virgil's part. See how he does this? Very canny, very demure. Where did these snakes come from? They come from Tenedos, so maybe the Greeks sent them. They seem to be water serpents that can swim, and maybe the Greeks have this in mind. But also they take refuge with Athena, so maybe they're divine envoys, magical serpents. Athena, even in the Iliad, is kind of the enemy of the Trojans. She refuses help to them when Hector and the Greek and the Trojan women come to beg help of Athena in Iliad book 6, she says no. She shakes her head no. And so perhaps Athena here is playing the role of arch nemesis of the Trojans. Maybe it's just the Greeks themselves doing more of their chicanery. Maybe it's a little bit of both. Virgil doesn't tell us, but he gives us, in the mouth of Aeneas, this famous passage which begins with ecce, the Latin word for look, behold. And this is one of the most powerful and ancient literary acts. You get this in all sorts of ancient poetry. Every ancient language has some kind of word that just means behold, and it has an even more immediate sense, I think, than our word behold, which sounds a little bit archaic. In Latin, it's ecce, if you've ever heard ecce homo, behold the man. In Hebrew, it's hine, which is all over the Bible. Hine matov umanaim shevet achim gam yachad, to see how good and how beautiful it is for two brothers to sit together. Hine, ecce, in Greek it's idu. We have what in Beowulf, which is slightly different because we're not totally sure if it means look or listen or what, but what is sort of the same idea, and this is what Aeneas gives us to kick this off, kind of shock us if we've been drowsing a little bit listening to his story. Now he says, but behold, and this is to get us really vivid. The Greeks would call it enargeia, the kind of vivid depiction of something that we see before our eyes. And so I've of course had to translate this passage and read at least part of it to you, and here it goes. Behold, from Tenedos through silent depths, a pair, my skin crawls, telling it, enormous serpents creep across the sea, together toward the shore, their crests erect among the waves, as red as blood. They make for Laocoön, and first the little pair, his boys. Each serpent wraps them in a stranglehold, entangling them and gorging on their helpless limbs, and then they turn towards Laocoön himself, who's coming, armed for rescue, but they snatch him up. With massive coils they encircle him, and now 2 times around his torso, twice around his neck, we watch their scale-encrusted backs envelop him, and with their necks and heads they tower over him. It's an incredibly pitiable scene with lots and lots of pathos. You have to just read a little bit of the Latin aloud, even if you don't understand Latin, because Virgil is giving a masterclass here. This is a tour de force. He's really kind of showing off in the way that he switches throughout this passage back and forth. Whenever he's talking about the snakes, he picks up this very hissing, kind of sinuous, wavy kind of speech and diction, and the words come all in this garbled order, and there's all these enjambments that lead us from line to line like a snake kind of slithering back and forth. And then the minute he comes to Laocoön, it becomes much more straightforward and direct, because Laocoön is the virtuous, straightforward, direct Trojan. He's the plain-talking, straight shooter, and he comes, but he gets tangled up in this web of very Greek, very coiling, very sinuous kind of serpentine writing. So he says, et primum parva duorum corpora naturum serpens amplexus uterque implicat. They're being entangled up, and you can hear some of those serpens amplexus, the many S sounds that we get for the hissing, of course. It's kind of word painting almost. And then when suddenly Laocoön comes, he's coming to the rescue. auxilio subeuntem actella ferentem. He's coming bearing arms with trying to help, but they bind him up in massive coils, spirisque legantin gentibus, in these big slithering coils. So Virgil is doing a lot here that I've tried to capture some of it in the English, but he is doing the most. He's pulling out all the stops for this passage, and it is in fact a victorious passage. It is a passage that has won itself a place in the canon, in the halls of Greek literature, and has survived down the ages, not only in literary art, but in visual art. And one of the things that I always like to stress when we're reading these poems together, which, by the way, if you haven't yet subscribed, please do, because we're going to go through this whole poem together bit by bit. Just hit subscribe on YouTube or Apple Podcasts or wherever you're listening. As we're going through this poem together, I always want to remind us that, yeah, it's awesome to read the Iliad and the Odyssey and the Aeneid, and Virgil's doing amazing stuff with Latin here, and it's really cool to get all the backstory and all of that. So all of this reading has its own intrinsic value, which I'm going to talk about a little bit more in a second. However, reading ancient literature is not just reading ancient literature. It's not just reading that one poem. It's also gaining access to an entire history and culture and language. Your history, your culture, your language, Western civilization is part of your inheritance. And if we don't understand it, then we just think it's all kind of a bunch of fancy old stuff. I don't know if you've ever walked into a room in a museum with a bunch of Renaissance paintings in it. If you think about walking in, and sometimes you walk into those rooms and so help me, all those paintings look the same, right? There are a bunch of different paintings with like naked people and some goats maybe, and they're running around, and it's this and that painting, and they all kind of look the same. The thing about grasping these poems and these literary sources is that next time you walk into one of those rooms, those paintings won't all look the same to you. They'll all have their own meaning. Each one will convey something different. There's that story of Marsyas and Apollo. There's the story of Laocoön. There's an image of Aeneas, right? And they all will convey and tell you different things because you're learning a whole cultural language. You're getting access to this giant civilization that has transcended time and place and been passed down. And now, if you didn't already, now you know the meaning of one of the most famous sculptures in all of Western art, the statue group of Laocoön and his sons. It's in the Vatican. Maybe you've seen it or seen pictures of it. These three human figures, little boys, although they're portrayed not as infants or as babies, but as kind of miniature people, which is a classic artistic trope. They're kind of mini adults. And then Laocoön, this muscular giant figure that's straining in this agonized way, straining against the serpents who are biting, as Virgil describes, biting at the boy and at the hip of Laocoön. And the whole thing, I'll throw an image of it up on YouTube if you're watching on YouTube. The whole thing is the very picture of effort and agony and pain. And people have said that this is the pre-Christian image of what suffering is. And because it's pre-Christian, there isn't redemption. There isn't the resurrection afterwards. There's just this death, right? There's just this horror and tragedy in what Nietzsche would have called Greek pessimism. We have a description from the ancient world in Pliny, who is slightly later than Virgil in the 1st century AD. And Pliny, in the Natural History, tells us about one of the most famous sculptures of the ancient world. He says, the Laocoön, which was in the palace of the Emperor Titus, a work that may be looked upon as preferable to any other production of the art of painting or bronze statuary. It is sculptured from a single block, both the main figure as well as the children, and the serpents with their marvelous folds. This group was made in concert by 3 most eminent artists, Agasander, Polydorus, and Athenodorus, natives of Rhodes. And so we think, and it's been thought for a long time, that this is that sculpture, that this sculpture managed to survive, or a copy of it managed to survive, but was lost for a very long time, buried, and dug up in 1506. So hundreds of years this thing lay dormant. I find this so moving, I have to say. And when I visit this sculpture, I've been a couple times to the Vatican. When I visit this sculpture and I read the Pliny, I just want to say to Pliny, I want to write back to him and say, hey, we got it. Like we kept it, right? We preserved this thing. And there's just something so moving about, Pliny not knowing whether this thing would be preserved, and yet it was saved from the ravages of time. The story goes that the minute it was uncovered, it was dug up in a vineyard. The Pope at the time, Pope Julius II, was very much a Renaissance Pope. He was very interested in classical learning and even in pagan antiquity. And so he summoned his court artists, including Michelangelo. He called Michelangelo to the site of the discovery. There was also an architect, Giuliano da Sangallo, and his son, who wrote an account of these guys, some of the most famous men in history, unbeknownst at this point, perhaps to them, but, Michelangelo among them. And it's said, the son, the younger Sangallo, says that the older Sangallo immediately said, this is the Laocoön which Pliny mentioned. So it was instantly recognized as this great work of art, and now it is preserved. And it's easy to see that this encapsulates so much of the anxieties and the pain and the suffering. It's like a little vial. These literary texts and these sculptural texts, they're little time capsules of humanity that come full of experience, and when we meet them with our souls, they connect us over centuries to people that lived very different lives than us, and yet somehow we're still undisputably, recognizably human in the same way that we are human. It's very, very beautiful. Thank you for joining me, as always, in this journey through the Aeneid. We're going to pick up again after Laocoön next time, carry on with the story of the destruction of Troy, because, of course, now the Trojans have allowed in their undoing. They take exactly the wrong message. They think, oh, the serpents must mean that Laocoön angered the gods, and so we need to take in this horse and listen to Sinon instead of Laocoön. It's their undoing. In the nighttime, the Greeks will sneak out and slaughter the Trojans. So we'll pick up with that next time. But now it's time for It Figures. This is our little segment at the end of every show where I talk about rhetorical figures of speech. Obviously, rhetoric and rhetorical tropes have been a big part of the whole theme of today's episode, and Virgil, being well aware that was going on, uses all sorts of classic rhetorical tropes and figures of speech, especially in Sinon's speech, because he's representing Sinon as the smart, crafty Greek as compared to the straightforward but doomed Trojan. And one of the techniques that he uses, which is one of my favorite figures of speech, something that once you see it, you'll see it everywhere, is called apophasis. And it's from a Greek word apophemi, which means to say no. And apophasis is basically the rhetorical figure of talking about something by saying you're not going to talk about it. You might call this, and some people have called this, the gossip's trope. This is the trope for spilling the tea. This is when you want to get into someone's business, air somebody out, air somebody's dirty laundry. Apophasis is the way to do it and still come out yourself smelling like a rose. Because the classic way of doing it is, I'm not even going to talk about her divorce. I don't even want to talk about what's going on with her kids, right? This is where you're talking about it by not talking about it. The Romans, who were very messy, loved to do this in rhetorical speeches. Cicero does it a lot in court speeches. I'm not even going to mention his problems with bribery. I'm not going to mention his personal problems, because we're here to talk about this particular matter before the court. But I'm not going to, don't get me started on, right? There's all sorts of different ways that we do apophasis. It's also sometimes called paralapsis, that is leaving something to one side, or parasyopesis, staying silent on the side of something. So all of these are different ways and shades and forms of telling something without telling it, talking about it without talking about it. This is very closely related to aposyopesis, say that 3 times fast, which basically just means falling silent altogether, cutting off mid-sentence with the hope that somebody will ask you to keep going. Don't make me sing, I won't go on. No, I won't talk. No, I couldn't possibly. And then you want everybody to be like, no, tell us, what do you mean? And this is exactly what Sinon does when he breaks off mid-sentence talking about Calchas. He says, and then that ratbag Odysseus, he paid off Calchas, but you don't need me to tell you that. You already know it. You've made up your mind already, and you just hate Greeks. That's aposyopesis, and you can see exactly what its purpose is, which is to draw people into your gossip so that they are then implicated. If you are watching season 3 of White Lotus, I don't know how many of my listeners are also fans of that show. I really enjoy it. I liked the first season a lot. It's got some great send-ups of kind of elite liberal wokeism and rich wokeness. Right now, I think Severance season 2 kind of has White Lotus season 3 beat. I think Severance season 2 is more original, more interesting, but White Lotus season 3 is still really fun. It's almost a soap opera at this point. And there are these three characters, these three ladies. Jacqueline, and Lori and Katie, I think are their names. You can tell me if I'm getting that wrong. But they're these sort of trio of the three graces, but they're doing this thing, this very recognizable gal pal thing, where they're constantly talking about how much they love each other, and they're also constantly undermining each other and talking about one another behind each other's backs. And the three of them who are doing a phenomenal performance. It's so fun to watch them in every scene. And they are masters of apophasis and aposiopesis. You can just watch them. If you want to know what it's like to do this trope in the modern day, just watch White Lotus season 3. There's a moment, for example, where two of them are talking about the third, and the third is gone, but she's just had this divorce, and her kid is really struggling, and they are gossiping about her without wanting to seem like they're gossiping about her. They still have they still have their friend's best interests at heart, and one of them says, and I guess that, their kid has turned into a real, well, and then the other one's like, What? And he says, well, I guess she's been, kicked around from school to school. And then they go and they launch in. So that little moment of aposiopesis, of falling silent, is an invitation to speak, to talk about that. So that's your It Figures for this week. Apophasis, aposiopesis, parasiopesis, paralapsis, and the last one, occultatio, or hiding. Now, if you can say that 5 times fast, I don't know, you get a prize. Okay. This is usually the part where I do the mailbag. And if you want to be in the mailbag, please do write into me at rejoiceevermore.substack.com. You can DM me, subscribe to my Substack. You can get my Friday essays, all of that. And every week I will be working through those questions that you send me, and I really enjoy reading them. However, this time I wanted to do something a little bit different. And that was to address a tweet that was not aimed at me. Nobody asked me, but I want to weigh in here on this tweet by a guy called Davey Fogarty. Fogarty, I guess, is how you say it, at Davey Fogarty. I don't want to get too down on this particular guy. He seems like a kid. I get the impression that he's one of these young bros kind of coming up. But he had a tweet that got a lot of attention, some negative, some positive, a lot of negative attention as well as positive attention, on X, I guess, formerly Twitter. He goes, reading books is now a waste of time. AI reasoning models can distill key insights and tell you exactly how to implement them based on everything they know about you. I want to take a second to talk about this, because I think this is really important. The idea about books that is represented here is a widespread idea about books, and I think it comes from optimizer culture and self-help culture. I've read some self-help books. I've even benefited from some self-help books. But the whole thing about self-help books is that none of them needs to be a book. They could all have been a PowerPoint presentation. And typically, public figures who write self-help books do it to promote their own brand and to get their message out there. Nothing wrong with that at all. Nothing wrong with writing or reading those kinds of books. But at the end of the day, their value to you is the lessons that you can draw out of them and write on a note card and bullet point. And the book is there both to increase the visibility and to drive the point home in a bunch of different ways and to give it to you in one among a number of different formats. But ultimately, it is possible to take a self-help book like Rich Dad, Poor Dad, or I don't know, I've read a few about negotiation, getting to yes, right? It's possible to take those books and turn them into a PowerPoint deck. And in fact, in the business world, in the startup world, in the optimizer world, that's a lot of what people spend their time doing is writing out decks, getting the main action items, getting the main points, distilling things, culling them down. And this guy is saying, AI can do that for you now, so what's the point of reading books? And I just want to stress, and I am so serious about this, that unless you understand that books are more than that, you are not going to make it in the AI age. This is something that guys like me love to talk about. We love to wax poetic about the values of literature in and of itself. There's nothing that literature produces for you that you're supposed to get out of it. You do get things out of it, but that's not the point. The point is doing the reading. The point is cultivating a life of the mind, cultivating a reading life. And we talk about this, and it's very nice, and people might even agree with me. And I know I have a lot of listeners who also are on the same page with me about this, but it still sometimes feels a little bit like a leisured pastime, just a nice thing that we happen to do. And we watch Dead Poets Society, and we have this hazy picture of a meadow grove somewhere where we all lounge about and read Keats, and isn't that lovely? And then we can go back to our optimizer culture and thinking about ourselves and our books and the rest of the time as like bullet point note card stacks. That ain't gonna cut it anymore. This stuff has gotten so serious. This has become existential that we understand there is an entirely different way of engaging with literature besides the self-help model that's almost like another species. It's a different universe altogether, and that is books for their own sake. Books as an encounter between two human souls. And nothing can outsource that, because to outsource it is to defeat the purpose. The purpose is not for somebody somewhere to know the plot of Brothers Karamazov. Even if the AI can give you a genuinely good summary, and some AIs can now give you a pretty good summary of like what happens in Crime and Punishment. Even if that's true, if it were possible to get everything out of Crime and Punishment that you need by summarizing the plot, Dostoevsky would have just written a plot summary. He could have already done that. He could have written the 3 bullet points. That's not what novels are for, and that's not what books are for. Even great nonfiction books are for the experience. They are for the encounter between two human souls that lights up when you read about Laocoön, when you see his face, when any kind of art delivers something to you that is part of your inner world. If you think that can be replaced by a machine, then you will be right. If you believe that all that's going on inside you is a series of data processing algorithms, then you will think you are able, and so you will be able to outsource your entire humanity to the machines. And there are going to be people, serious people, wealthy people, making that argument that we don't even actually need people to have the experience. The machines can generate the output of the experience all together, all to themselves. Where this ultimately leads is human extinction, is anti-humanism, is throwing ourselves into the cosmic void and letting the bots take over. Conversations about the meaning of literature are no longer fun parlor games, and they never really were. They are very quickly going to escalate into conversations about why we as human beings should exist at all. And the answer is not because we can do numbers better than anything else on planet Earth. Our machines can do that better now. It's not because we can summarize some stack of productivity points and optimize them and churn ourselves into like the perfect little metric bots, the perfect little Ken dolls that we can post on Instagram. None of that is the point. The point is you. The point is your soul for its own sake, which was created out of love by a God who is love for no other reason than that he desires you to be around so very much that he went to the cross and died. That's the point. And if you don't understand why we read, then you won't understand why we should exist. I'm desperately passionate about this now, and I'm going to keep harping on this and keep giving you this message over and over again. The point of this podcast, the point of this literature, the point of existing is to shape and cultivate the soul. Are there things that AI can do to help us with that? Abso-freaking-lutely. I love Grok, man. I'm learning to use it now. It's doing all sorts of helpful things for me, like it's summarizing news stories when I just want to get the top 3 bullet points, and all the different news articles seem biased or they're convoluted. I just get Grok to tell me, like, could you please churn through the news and tell me the baseline so that I can then go from there to read longer pieces so that I have a base of understanding. There's all sorts of uses for Grok. But if you outsource a task to Grok, you are inherently saying that you don't value that task in and of itself. You don't care about doing the task. You only care about the product of the task. And if you say that about reading, then you say it also of your own soul. Do not give your soul over to the bots. Outsource whatever you like to Grok, but not the process of being human, because it can't do that. It's not good at that. You're good at that because you were designed for it. And that's what we're going to keep doing week by week right here on the show. Looking forward to more Aeneid next time. See you in a week for more truth, beauty, and the stuff that matters.